Welcome to our week 4 weekly wrap-up video, brought to you with this funny background of these guys on a boat for ASU.edu. Apparently it has to do with mentorship, so I don't really know what's happening there. But congrats on making it. We're really more than halfway through the course now, which is exciting. Only have a few more weeks left, and so hopefully there shouldn't be any surprises at this point in the class. I just wanted to go over a few things with you guys about logistics, about the next couple days, the next week, and then review a couple things that didn't really come up as heavily in the discussion that I feel like is worth keeping in mind, just for the future. So the first thing that I wanted to remind you guys of is that your midterm is open until Sunday by the end of the day. So if you haven't started that yet, remember that once you open it, you have 2 hours to take it, and so plan accordingly. You also, like usual, have your Unit 4 discussion board posts were due yesterday, and then your response, as usual, is also due Sunday night. So make sure that you don't leave too much for the last minute on Sunday if possible. And I did want to let you guys know that I will have your Unit 4 grades posted by the end of Monday for your discussion board. So you guys should know by Monday night what your grades were for this past week for Unit 4. And then hopefully my plan is to have your midterm grades for you by the end of next Friday, so about a week from today. Barring any major catastrophe, barring any issues that come up with grading, I should have them by this time next week. Because I have 2 things to grade this week, and just because we're at this certain point in the class, I just wanted to give you guys a heads up that the feedback will be briefer for this week and probably for the rest of the class, because for the most part I'm writing the same things. Like, it's not like, even if you're not getting 50 out of 50 every week, usually you have pretty consistent issues as to why you're not receiving full credit, and I don't think there should be any surprises at this point. If you get 45 out of 50 or 50 out of 50, I probably won't be leaving any comments like before where I would tell you, oh, this was particularly good, or this was really insightful, that sort of thing. If you're getting A-level work, good job. I'm assuming you probably won't need feedback for the most part. If you're getting 40 out of 50 or below, I will continue to leave comments letting you know what you missed points on and what you can improve on, but it will probably be briefer. Just sort of very straightforward, too much summary, citation issues, lacking argument, that sort of thing. Whereas for the past few weeks, I've tried to give you guys pretty substantial feedback so that you guys know what my expectations are, and so you can follow up with me if you have any further questions from here on out for the course. So that's the timeline with grades for next week. And I think that's all I wanted to tell you guys administratively. So that leads us to the content of this week. We talk more about the American Revolution, which is one of my favorite topics to talk about, which I think I told you guys last week in my video too. So I've been going through reading your discussions, replying to when necessary, but a few things have come up that I want to make sure that I clarify and that you guys all know. If it doesn't come across as substantially in the reading, I still think a few things to talk about are important. So I was surprised that not that many of you discussed anything. A few of you did, but not very many of you talked about, well, how radical or how revolutionary was the American Revolution? Most of you guys sort of stuck to the logistics. You talked about the advantage that the colonists had during the war, talked about the debates over the Articles of Confederation and then later the Constitution, which groups wanted what and why, and then a lot of you explained what compromises were made, which is great. And it's certainly important to keep in mind the logistics of how we got the United States Constitution. It is a pretty important document. But beyond that, not a lot of you really got into the arguments about the particulars about what may or may not have happened after the American Revolution, or who the American Revolution primarily benefited. And I just kind of wanted to talk to you guys about that really briefly, because the American Revolution really did not significantly change the lives of a lot of people living in the early United States. So I'm going to talk about a few things in terms of that. We're going to talk about first the 3/5 compromise. Some of you guys, when you brought up what role slavery played in the American Revolution and afterwards. Some of you guys brought up that the Constitution contains this provision called the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise was put in place and is related to the second issue that I'm really going to talk about here in a second, which is the Electoral College. But I do want to make sure that the Three-Fifths Compromise, that we're all clear. A lot of you guys got sort of the very basic that the Three-Fifths Compromise purpose is to figure out how to count slaves in electoral voting rights for the South. When the South when we were having discussions about what the Constitution should be, right, you know, the New Jersey plan, the Virginia plan, right, what is the balance supposed to be with bigger states, with states with more heavy populations, how can that compromise be made? So, the South, of course, as you guys read about, was very intent on making sure that the Constitution did, to a certain extent, protect slavery, right? There's the line that talks about how slavery, the slave trade, can't be touched for at least 20 years, and this gives early politicians some time to figure out what to do after that 20 years has passed. However, until then, another issue was the South found themselves in a bit of a dilemma. They had gone to great lengths to make sure that everyone knew that slaves were not people, that slaves had no place in this new country, that they did not count as citizens, that they had no rights. Effectively not people. However, if you say that African American slaves in the South aren't people, you're removing the majority of the South's population. So, the South does not want that because they know that the more people they have, the more power they're going to have in Congress by the House of Representatives. So, they are stuck. They need to figure out a way that they can use slaves towards their political power by continuing, even though they're still denying slaves those political rights. That's how we get to the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise doesn't really say that slaves count as 3/5 of a person. It means that politically, but just to be clear, Southerners did not think that slaves were people literally at all. For the purposes of counting population is where we get the 3/5 from. Because slaves, of course, couldn't be one whole person, the South would prefer them not politically to be recognized as any sort of person at all, but they do need that population to count for their voting numbers in Congress. So, the Three-Fifths Compromise is an example of how slavery bolstered the political power of white men in the South. Keep that in mind. Because, again, slaves have no part in this early United States. All this talk about freedom, liberty, individual rights, universal rights, inalienable rights, not for slaves. Not for slaves in literally any capacity at all, ever. So, that's just one example of how revolutionary rhetoric got early politicians, white men, into a bit of a bind because what they were talking about had very clear exclusions, and it had political consequences in terms of their voting rights once the Constitution was decided and once they were trying to ratify it to make all the different side states happy. So, Three-Fifths Compromise, really just giving the South more political power that they are lacking because they do not have as many white people in the South as the North does. So, that relates to my second issue, which is the Electoral College. One of the debates in the Constitution was, well, we have this thing called the president now, but how are we going to decide who actually gets to be president? Good question. There are three options put forth at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. The first one is that the president is picked by Congress. This is voted out because it was thought that it would be that's giving essentially too much power to the Congress. If Congress, the legislative branch, is electing the executive branch, then it's kind of thought that those two branches wouldn't have clear distinctions and that there would be too much power between those two branches to basically do whatever they wanted and override the judiciary. The second option is that the president is picked through state legislators specifically, the same sort of state conventions and legislators that were used to elect representatives early on in the Senate. So that also, it's vetoed for essentially the same reason. This is giving too much power to the same group of people. It's not separating the powers enough for this balance to work. The third option, and by far the most unpopular option, is direct election of the president. Right, now if you guys think about our current political system today, we know that the Electoral College is what elects the president. So we know that this is a combination of, right, population for the most part. So the problem with the direct election of the president, and the reason that the founding fathers decided that direct election, or one person, one vote, is sort of how we talk about it today for electing the president, would not work is largely, again, due to slavery. Madison himself writes a series of letters because Madison is the one who ends up proposing what becomes eventually the Electoral College. And he talks about how they simply could not have direct election of the president because there were just not enough people in the South. And he felt that direct election of the president would result in the North having consistent political power, the consistent power to choose who the president would be, because they had so much more people. Even with the 3/5 compromise, it is unlikely that the South would have ever had enough political power to maintain the population needed to really come head-to-head with the North and be competitive in presidential elections. So slavery, again, is very key to the Electoral College. If someone asks you, hey, why do we have the Electoral College? Now you can tell them, it was literally to make the southern states happy and to make sure that they held a disproportionate amount of power, political power, compared to their population. Now you know. This leads, so what this gets us is essentially another misbalance of power in the early republic. Almost all of the early presidents are elected from one state. That state is Virginia. Virginia was like the California of the early republic, right? Today, California has the most electoral votes. They therefore hold a significant amount of sway in the Electoral College. It'd be really difficult to win the presidency without winning California. That's what Virginia was like in the early days, and we're actually going to see that the first string of presidents, who almost all come from Virginia, are often referred to as the Virginia dynasty, because Virginia had such a disproportionate amount of political power in the early years of the United States. The way that it played out, specifically in terms of Virginia being a slaveholding state, was even though Virginia had a much smaller population than a lot of northern states, they had almost double the amount of electoral votes in Congress, right? So remember, the trick with the Electoral College and the 3/5 compromise is largely that slaves are being counted as part of the population, but they have no voice in government. So you're adding numbers without needing to be beholden to that particular constituency. So white politicians in the South are benefiting from the fact that they have more numbers, but those numbers don't matter at all politically to them. They get to make all the choices for what happens to slavery without any input of slaves at the same time. So those are two major issues in the early republic, the founding of the United States, that have to do with slavery, that don't always sort of get the direct tie to slavery that they really deserve. In terms of also talking about how radical the revolution is, I'm going to wrap up with you guys by talking about women. So I don't think any of you talked about women in your discussion board posts. I study women as a historian, right? I consider myself a women's historian, so I do need to make sure that we are at least on the same page going forward as we talk about what democracy means, what republicanism means, who is democracy and republicanism for. It is not for women or slaves in the early republic. So, as you guys learned from this chapter, women in the United States were incredibly important to pulling off the American Revolution. They were the ones that made things like those boycotts possible. Women were a huge part of the boycott efforts, and later, during the actual war itself, they provided a lot of behind-the-scenes work that were incredibly important, like providing uniforms, bringing supplies, clothing, being nurses was almost all onto women during the American Revolution. So you might think that maybe after women step up during the American Revolution, taking place in these boycotts, taking place in the war itself, literally participating in the war effort, that they might have proven to men during this time period that they deserved to be considered capable of being political citizens with full political rights. That doesn't happen at all. So why? What's it like to be a woman in the early United States? Well, women are not just coincidentally left out of the Constitution when the Constitution says we the people, they meant men. So what is it like to be a woman in the early United States? Why didn't the American Revolution reach them? The most important thing for you to remember in terms of political rights for women during this time period is that there is a legal concept called femme covert. It's spelled F-E-M-E and then C-O-V-E-R-T. Femme covert literally means covered women. And what this phrase comes from is it means that once a woman was married, she was literally legally covered by her husband's identity. Her individual identity absolutely ceased to exist. The husband made all the choices for her, and married women were legally barred from doing almost anything. They didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to own property. They didn't have the right to enter contracts. They didn't have the right to sue or go to court. On and on and on and on. On and on. They couldn't own property. Just the list is like endless. So, single women before, in that brief period sometimes where their women are old enough to not be covered by their fathers, who originally have all that sort of legal jurisdiction over them, but are not yet married, do have a significant amount of autonomy for that brief period. Single women did occasionally, depending on what state, these laws do sort of vary by state in the early Republic, could sometimes own property, could sometimes do business, enter contracts, or go to court, those sorts of things, depending on where they lived. But there was a social backlash. If you were unmarried as an adult woman for an extended period of time, you were definitely thought of as weird. You were probably going to have a lot more social hostility towards you, even if you enjoyed those legal protections that married women didn't have. So, some of you might be very familiar, might have at least heard of this exchange between Abigail Adams and this letter that she's writing to her husband, John Adams, second president, where she says, "Remember the ladies." I'm going to post, so that I don't have time to talk about it all here, but I'm going to post Abigail's whole letter and then show you guys what her husband, John, writes as a response. Abigail later includes the phrase, "All men would be tyrants if they could," meaning that she believes that every man had the capacity to essentially abuse power, and that it was important that men be aware of this tendency of themselves. And that's where this "remember ladies" come from. So because you're tyrants, please remember the ladies and keep us in mind as you're designing these new laws, as you're writing the new Constitution. John writes a really snarky response back, and he basically says, like, yes, men are tyrants, and we're not giving up our power in any capacity to the ladies in this new republic. So you guys can talk about that in your responses for this week. You can just file it away as good things to know about how the country was founded. And so in conclusion, as you guys do your responses due Sunday, as you think about the midterm, as you think about just what the history of the United States means and what it means to look back on the American Revolution and be like, oh, this was such a great moment for liberty, for freedom, this was very radical. Just remember to think about all the things that did not change at all. In some cases, it got worse. The argument can certainly be made that the early republic was a time of constricting liberties for a lot of people. Like I said, these laws about what women can't do become more extensive from the 1790s onward. Slavery, too, we're going to see, as we get closer to the Civil War, slavery becomes much more heavily regulated, and any rights that might have been enjoyed by slaves or by free blacks become heavily restricted. Fugitive slave laws become much stricter. We're going to talk about how westward expansion and land really fueled the South's need to hold on to slavery and to make sure they were holding on to slavery and that slaves were not running away. They needed to treat them more harshly to scare them into staying and not trying to run away. So, although the founding fathers had just created this new republic that was all supposed to be about liberty, freedoms, getting rid of tyranny, that did not affect as big a population as you might have been led to think thus far. So, keep that in mind. Don't forget about your midterm because you'll be in trouble. And if you have any questions, since I'm giving a little bit less feedback from now on, again, this is to make sure that you guys all get your grades timely. Unfortunately, because our class just moves so quickly, I don't have time to both get grades back to you quickly and offer extensive feedback. I'm assuming you guys probably benefit more from having grades quickly than extensive feedback every week. So if you ever have a question about feedback or don't understand why you got a grade, as always, feel free to email me. And that should be it for this week. And I'll talk to you guys soon.